Welcome to Civil Discourse, a podcast where participants are free to share their ideas, empathize with other perspectives, and who intend to advance to a better solution to fix a societal ill. We will focus on topics that are particularly complicated. In a time where information is from sources more opinionated than ever, our mission is to find solutions and goals to accelerate the nation's progress with cultural impunity. I'm your host, Todd Furniss. Hello and welcome to today's episode of Civil Discourse hosted by Todd Furniss. I'm Todd Furniss, your host. And as always, if you enjoy our content, please like, share, and subscribe. We rely on your support for the content to be produced, and we hope you enjoy it. Today, I'm really excited about our guest. We have a fantastically insightful and accomplished person in the form of my good friend, David Tice. David, welcome.
Glad to be with you and your listeners, Todd.
Thank you. And we're going to have a fun conversation. Well, I shouldn't say fun. It's going to be an interesting conversation about some interesting challenges we have that not many people are aware of. They come to light every now and again, but I want to kind of tee this up in terms of the context, if I can, with you and your background, because yours is not a normal background. Kind of on the one hand, a very successful investor, on the other hand, a producer, an executive producer, and director of films. Those things don't normally come together.
No, that's exactly true. So I've been a money manager really for the last 30 years, and that's where I made my living, and used to run the Prudent Bear Fund and then also the Prudent Global Income Fund. About 2011, I actually executive produced a movie, Soul Surfer.
That's right.
Which starred Dennis Quaid, Helen Hunt, Carrie Underwood, and talked about Bethany Hamilton, who lost an arm to a shark and came back. A very, very inspiring Christian story.
But there's another element to this, which is, in essence, what I see between the lines is you're investing in people, right? You want to invest in character and integrity and in values of individuals and kind of promote the development of that. Is that fair to say?
Fair enough. And I have not really been involved in that many movies, frankly. This movie that we're going to talk about is pretty much a one-off. I did have this one in 2011, as I said, but pretty much this is new to me.
So what prompted you to get involved with Soul Surfer? Because that was kind of the first new approach you had to the world of commerce outside of investments.
So I actually went to Sundance Film Festival, and I told a girlfriend at the time that I was not going to finance a movie. There was no way I would finance a movie. But then I ended up falling in love with this story, and I felt like this was such a phenomenal opportunity because this is right when faith-based films had started to take off. This was right after Fireproof, and I felt like Bethany Hamilton already had 5 million viewers, and she was well known, and felt like that story needed to be brought to the big screen so that individuals could experience her story of, passion and coming back from adversity as well as Christianity.
Well, also triumph and hope, right?
Right.
So that's a great story. And do you keep up with her and how she's doing?
I do. In fact, believe it or not, in Waco, Texas, I went and surfed with her.
Waco?
Waco. And in fact, I was talking to her manager, and they said, well, she's going to be in Waco surfing. I said, wait a second, Waco, there's no ocean there. But it's actually the second kind of artificial, synthetic surf facility. And so I was there.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. Well, then you kind of went back into the world of investments and stayed focused on that. Now you've just produced and directed this film. Let's talk about that for a second, because it's an important topic and it's gotten some attention recently, but I don't think the attention it deserves.
Well, I've been a geopolitical warrior and a student really for the last couple of decades. And so I've been a bit of a Boy Scout in terms of prepare for the worst, hope for the best, leave God to the rest. And so I had the highest ranking Soviet spy that's ever defected from the Soviet Union in my living room about 15 years ago.
Wow.
So I've studied Chinese and Russian defector literature. And so I've followed some interesting people that believe that the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and Iranians really are our adversary. And even though we went through a period where people thought, oh, the Cold War is over, Russia's good guys, and China, they just want to go to shopping malls like we do, everything's okay, I remained skeptical about that. And so this movie literally somewhat fell into my lap in that I heard about another movie about grid security. And so I was going to help finance that and ended up doing some research, and I found this other film that had been produced, but it wasn't complete. And so I felt like it was about 70% done. I found out it was maybe 50% done, and spent a lot of time and effort on it. I really feel like there was a God calling in it. I had some resources, I had some experience, I had some beliefs in this particular issue. I knew the power of film. I knew that there were a number of what I call grid warriors that had been working behind the scenes, trying to work with regulators, legislators to have our grid protected. But frankly, they hadn't been making much headway. And a lot of them have told me that this film really is starting to open some doors and is going to help make a difference. And so I'm saying that I'm converting this movie into a movement.
So one of the things that I think is obvious in today's world is we live in a pretty polarized environment. People on the left arguing one thing and people on the right arguing another. And the frustration and the worry that many would have is that you get put into a category immediately when you use certain words or make certain references. And I want to kind of back out of that for just a second. One of the clips that I watched in preparation for today's conversation highlighted the fact that the grid is vulnerable to a variety of electromagnetic pulses, right? And those electromagnetic pulses can come in the form of anything from intentional malevolent acts to acts of nature, right? So sunbursts, for example, that is one of the references in the clips. So let's talk about the variety of things that can cause a problem with our grid, and let's talk about exactly how vulnerable our grid exactly is.
Okay, so there are 4 major threats that we talk about in the movie, and actually there's a 5th threat, which is severe weather, right, which is what we experienced with Snowmageddon in Texas. But we're talking about the 4 major threats, which is physical attack, cyber attack, electromagnetic pulse attack, or EMP, and then something that's actually a natural EMP or a geomagnetic disturbance or a coronal mass ejection. So
okay,
that's
slow down now. That was a bunch of really large words, and I'm a lawyer, and I had a tough time. So geomagnetic disturbance. Okay, so let's frame that one first, or define that one first.
Okay, so geomagnetic disturbance is also known as a coronal mass ejection. And then you can also say that's a solar storm.
Okay.
And so essentially that is very similar to an EMP because it's an electromagnetic pulse, but this electromagnetic pulse comes from the sun. And so it's a solar storm. And our scientists tell us that the Earth will be subject to a geomagnetic disturbance essentially once every 100 years or so.
Okay, so this is kind of like, not like the candy, it's a sunburst of sorts, right? So something pops on the sun, which happens periodically. It's just, you can't avoid it and you can't create it, but it happens naturally about once every 100 years or so. Is that fair to say?
Exactly.
Okay, and so that's a natural cause of something that would make our grid go down, and it would have a pretty substantial effect worldwide, right? Any part of the world that's subject to this force at the time of the sunspot, for what I'm calling the sunspot, the sunburst.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it all depends on the magnitude because the sun is shooting off these flares, all the time. But then it's if they hit the Earth, is the issue. And over time, one of them is, statistically going to hit the Earth. But there are still some that are bigger than others. And so actually in a regulatory situation, there is measurement of how big this solar storm might be. And so the biggest one is called the Carrington event that occurred in 1859. And then there was another significant one in 1921 in, it was called the Railroad Storm.
That was about 8 years early.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, but yeah, so go ahead.
And then there was another one in 1989. And so that every 100 years is talking about a super big one.
Right.
Because sometimes there are smaller ones, that occur.
Right. So just to kind of put the box around this one particular type of threat, this is a natural threat, could happen once every 100 years or so, could not necessarily adverse us in a way that we would feel per se. In other words, this isn't going to cause radiation problems necessarily. We're not going to burn up or anything, but it's going to affect our underlying systems like the grid, right?
Right. So what electromagnetic pulse does, it's essentially gamma waves that come either from a blast in the atmosphere, which
So
we'll
radio
get into
waves, right?
later.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure if it's radio waves. Physics was my worst class in high school, I have to admit that. But it's gamma waves.
Maybe it's light waves. I don't know.
Yeah. And so they end up impacting sensitive electronics. And so sensitive electronics can be impacted and essentially knocked out or fried, from this high intensity gamma waves.
So gamma waves are emitted by the sun into our electrical systems that then adversely affects our systems and causes them to shut down and fail.
Exactly.
Okay, very good. So now let's walk through the other three.
Right. Okay, so what's interesting is that there's some critics of this film that say everything's going to be all right and our adversaries would never do anything about this. Okay, so that's why we bring up this geomagnetic disturbance, because even if you think everybody is kumbaya and the Chinese are good people, or there would be mutually assured destruction and this would never happen, we still have to worry about the sun. So those other three adverse effects or threat vectors are physical attack, cyber attack, and then an electromagnetic, an EMP, electromagnetic pulse.
So the malevolent acts you refer to are likely, I want to make sure that we're characterizing this correctly, are likely to be performed either by what I would characterize as militant fringe groups, people who are, a small group of people who are doing bad things, or a governmental entity, but not the general society of a country, right? You're not saying Chinese people are bad. You're saying the Chinese government may have a governmental interest in effecting this bad outcome on our country and therefore take these actions to undermine our economy, our civil society, right?
Exactly. So we look at it as either being state actors or essentially terrorist groups.
Right.
And that was a good point about the Chinese people are great people, we quibble with the CCP
right.
and their leaders,
right.
that, are the issue. And so a physical attack could be carried out by a terrorist group, I'd say.
Yes.
And an EMP or a massive cyber attack we're at most risk from a state actor.
Now, did I understand this correctly? Because some of these things can be used as tools defensively. Like, didn't this just happen in Ukraine with the drones flying over Ukraine, where an EMP was hit a cluster of drones and took them out?
Certainly, that's the case. I'm not particularly informed about that particular incident.
But you can use this as a defensive weapon, is my point.
Oh, an EMP?
Right.
I believe you can. Yes.
So it can be an offense. Let's assume that we can have it used as an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon. That means it can be used for good or bad, potentially. But we still need to understand that in the event that it's being used for the wrong purposes to harm us, we need to be prepared, right? Which is really what you're advocating.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty small occasion that's used positively, because EMP is a negative weapon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to wipe out electronics. So
Right, but if you have a missile coming in that's got computer chips on board, or if you've got drones flying overhead that are armed, or if you have other forms of electronic-based activity that are seeking to do harm to you, that's the
it could work that way. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the gamma rays and we talked about the intentional acts. What are the other two?
Okay, so the other two are physical attacks, and essentially we cover a story in Metcalf, California, right outside of Silicon Valley back in 2013. And in fact, this was covered by 60 Minutes story that appeared in January and then also rerun in August.
Of this year?
Of this year.
Yes. So it's important to emphasize, this is not something that happened a bazillion years ago. This is something that's happening and being reported on right now, in essence, right? It's very current.
This attack happened in 2013, but it was just covered by 60 Minutes, because what was interesting is it was pretty much covered up for a year. And our utility did not bring this up. And a year later, it appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And so here, 60 Minutes, here 8 years later, found it to be so important and relevant that they just ran a story just a few months ago.
Wow. And I think, what you just pointed out is interesting. What would cause somebody to cover this up? This ought to be a bipartisan issue, one would think, right? There shouldn't be an ideology behind covering something up. That everybody should have a shared concern around doing the right thing with regard to our grid.
It's interesting. There's a little bit of an attitude inside government to, make us all be happy and go to the shopping mall and not really go back to the 50s generation where it was duck and cover, and worry about storing up food, et cetera. That tends to cause people to, party less and buy less merchandise, and therefore GDP declines. And therefore there's a lot of attention sometime to, don't worry, be happy.
Yeah. So that's interesting to hear. And troubling that anybody in a position of consequence would advocate that, because they want people to shop more, or to not be overly concerned about big issues.
So there is also a second rationale. They didn't want a potential terrorist group to do a copycat attack as well,
and that has some legitimacy to it, I guess. Do you worry about that? Is somebody watching the film and saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we could actually go do bad things here"?
I worry about that a lot, and the film goes over the fact that our big Achilles heel is our transformers that are inside our substations. Mm-hmm. And if you just drive around today, you'll see substations in your neighborhood, that are protected by a chain link fence.
Right.
And there's nothing on top. And so therefore, these days we have drones. I mean, a drone could essentially, drop a little bomb on top of a transformer and knock it out. So one of the things that came out of this 60 Minutes story that we covered in the movie was that FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, actually came out with a study that said that as few as 9 critical substations, if they were at key nodes, if they were taken out, it could cause a coast-to-coast blackout.
That was astonishing. I was really jarred when I was looking at the clips. I was like, holy cow, 9 substations. Yeah. That's not a very large number, and it wouldn't take a lot of resources to coordinate an attack like that and really create some, at the very least, some massive havoc.
Exactly.
Yeah. So as we look at this, what do you advocate? I got to believe that you come up with you advocate a solution aside from simply, be aware of the problem. And because I think the solution comes in a couple of different forms. One is, what do you do about these substations? But also, how do you collaborate with others across the spectrum, no pun intended, to help solve this problem and fortify our infrastructure?
Well, this is a massive problem. And so there needs to be more spending. There needs to be better regulation. There needs to be more legislation, even though we do have some legislation in place that is not being carried out effectively by our agencies. We need to wake up the American people so that I remember the famous movie Network back from 1973, where Howard Beale, the broadcaster, said, "We're mad as hell. We're not going to take this anymore." And so when you think about the consequence of this, and you think of the lack of attention, and you think about what happened with COVID-19, and we realized we were not ready with enough masks and enough ventilators, although, there were certainly issues about exaggeration about COVID-19. We could have handled that better, that we won't get into. But I'm talking about a massive problem that we haven't talked about this. There has been a EMP commission that studied this particular issue, specifically electromagnetic pulse attack, and it could kill between 75 to 90% of American citizens.
Wow. So let's go back to solving the problem, because this is, from what I took away from the clips, and we're going to show a couple of the clips here during the course of the podcast, but let's talk about how eminently solvable this problem is. What would you do to harden the infrastructure?
So there is equipment out there right now, zero ground blockers and various protective devices. And in fact, our military has been protecting their command control centers and our missiles, for 2 or 3 decades. And in fact, we show a clip in the film where General John Hyten, who is the ex-vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was saying this electromagnetic pulse threat is real and would cause all these electronics to go out. And then he's asked about, well, how about our command control centers and our military? And he says, well, yes, we've protected those, but our civilian infrastructure, we haven't quite got around to that.
Yeah. Well, and in fairness, that's not the military's job, is not to protect. The military's job is not to protect our civilian infrastructure, but it is our government's job, perhaps, and it certainly that should be the focus of FERC, for example. So when you say that, so the point number one is that there is equipment and other forms of hardening readily available today without issue,
right.
And I gotta believe it's affordable.
It's very affordable,
okay.
And there has been certain electronics. There's a device called Ciprotech, that was developed inside of Texas by a company, Centerpoint Energy, that handles Houston's electric utilities, as well as Siemens. And they have found that putting this on substations is very, very cost effective and essentially much less than the cost of a new substation.
Right.
And essentially it's been shown to a number of utilities, and the utilities have balked at installing it because, frankly, they're waiting for the regulators to tell them they have to put it on.
So I guess they're just worried about margins. Is that the idea? The cost of that capital expenditure, or whether it's done as CapEx or OpEx, I gotta believe it's gonna be CapEx. They're just gonna not do that.
So this is very complicated, and it's been something called regulatory capture, where NERC, which is the North American Reliability Corporation, actually regulates a lot of the bulk power system, and they fall under FERC. And this is very complicated. I don't want your viewers.
No, that's why they come here. Our viewers don't come here because they want soft and easy. They want complicated stuff, and this is important to unpack. So let's go to it.
But essentially, 9 out of 12 of those trustees have come from the utilities. So the other issue is the utilities also are subject to rate makers, and they are under great pressure to keep rates down, and therefore they feel like, well, this probably isn't going to occur on my watch, and they're not sure if they're going to get reimbursed for it or not, and so it's easier just with inertia just to leave it alone, and let's just do it if we have to, but otherwise we're not going to do it. Now, some of the utilities have been more proactive than others, and we mentioned some of those in the film. and they should be commended. And we say that in the film. But there's a number of them that have not done all they should. And a lot of them are doing some, but frankly, one of our solutions from the film is that, you mentioned this before, that the government should pay for it. And right now, I'd say the utilities have balked about paying for it because it is complicated. They're not sure if they're going to get paid or not. They would rather think about heating up our pizza ovens rather than North Korea. Right. And so they don't really have, strategists are saying, oh, is North Korea going to do something or not? So frankly, we have Homeland Security, DOE, the utility companies all pointing, your fault, your problem, your problem. And that's where we are.
So I would just clarify, I don't know if the government should pay for it or not, but certainly the utility companies should bear the primary exposure for that because they're getting paid to provide electricity. If they can't provide electricity, then they don't get paid. So, like any other form of corporation, if you can't produce your goods or services, then you've got a problem. So, and you don't get paid. So, they have an economic interest, one would think, and the government has an additional regulatory interest in providing for the health and welfare of its citizens. And that's done at a state level, which is why a lot of these things are regulated at the state level in addition to the federal commerce issues. But certainly FERC has a responsibility there, and it's puzzling as to why FERC wouldn't be more, if not firm, aggressive in its stance in carrying out the regulations that exist today, and also make sure that the utilities are doing the job that they need to do.
From what I understand, FERC doesn't really possess that much power with this. It's all with NERC.
Okay.
And even though FERC is, above NERC, I'm not sure what command and control they have.
And the point you're making on NERC is that it has a bunch of implicit conflicts of interest given the number of trustees who come from or currently are employed by utility companies.
So I can provide a quick example of how bad it is for NERC.
Please, yeah.
Tom. So as you mentioned before, this is a bipartisan issue. Yeah. We have Barack Obama, Donald Trump, both tackled this issue.
Some would say those are polar opposites.
I would say so.
Political spectrum.
So Barack Obama, back in 2015, proposed that we have better protection for space weather or geomagnetic disturbance.
Right.
Okay, and he said we should protect against a 100-year storm. Okay, so he signed an executive order and then it got sent to NERC. Essentially, we talked about the storms before as far as the 1859 Carrington event. So this is measured in terms of volts per kilometer. And there were various measurements that were made and estimates, even though that was a long time ago. So there was a determination that this level, 1859, was, say, at this level. Then we had the 1921 railroad storm, was this level. And then we have the Quebec storm in 1989, which was this level. So do you know what NERC did? NERC ended up going out and they determined a benchmark storm. So they chose this 1989 benchmark storm to protect against in terms of volts per kilometer. And therefore they issued regulations for our transformers to protect our civilian infrastructure at this level down here. There were other grid warrior groups that saw this coming. They were proposing to have rehearings saying you can't do this. They never got a rehearing. And therefore, the regs that are on the books today are down here.
So you're saying they acknowledged the issue and did as the least possible to solve the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so in order to then get it resolved, we have to go through presumably either another Q&A and an open proposal question or open question with the regulatory agency, or we need to have legislation passed that directs the regulatory agent to go do something.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I got to believe you're advocating both, right?
Yes. And so in fact, I've been able to get in front of, some leaders, staffers of leaders, heading up various committees. And, there's talk about us instituting, hearings. There's been a lot of recalcitrance inside DOE and DHS, because there's been legislation that's been asking for various actions to have been taken, and it hasn't happened.
Right. So you're one of the things that you have as a call to action in the clips that we'll see and in the movie itself is to reach out to your legislators, reach out to your elected political officials, and bring this issue to their attention and say, hey, I'm advocating you go do something about this.
Exactly. And in fact, we have created mechanisms by which all you have to do is add your home address and a few clicks of your mouse, and you will have pre-written letters that we've composed with, experts that telling them what new legislation we need, how this should be carried out going forward.
So it's a very easy thing to do. It
Right.
doesn't take a lot. All you have to do is recognize the problem and take action by clicking your mouse buttons on a few times.
Right.
So what movements have you seen? First of all, the film is out now, right?
Yes, it's out now, but it's possible. We've had a soft launch, and so it's been available for the next few days. You'll be able to see it. We're planning on taking it off the market while we build kind of a crescendo for a hard launch.
And when would you like to? When do you plan?
That's going to be in about a month.
Okay.
So you might be in a bit of a hiatus where you might not be able to watch it, but we will have a trailer, a lot of information on our website, and I think we're going to have a 12-minute version, that really goes over a lot of the highlights of this, so you'll be able to see.
So that'll almost be a video podcast length, much like this one.
Yeah.
That people will be able to access even
Right.
if the film is not formally launched.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have a few days where people can still see it,
Right.
and then there'll be a pause while you build a crescendo, and then you anticipate that the hard launch will be in about a month or so.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Very good. And then what reaction have you seen thus far to people who have seen the movie, or alternatively to elected officials who hopefully have seen the movie but may not have?
Well, they've been astounded. And really, there's a range of emotions that people go through when they see the film. First of all, there's surprise, and then there's shock, and then there's some despair, and then there's anger. And then at the end of the film, you mentioned my positivity in terms of Soul Surfer and believing in people.
Right.
We actually end the film with a very positive, medley, saying how America's had their back up against the wall before. And we overcame the Nazi Third Reich, and we built the national highway system, and we ended up overcoming racial segregation. And we did all that. And
So
we
America
said
can get its arms around each other and solve this problem, is your point.
yeah. So we wanted to end the movie in a happy place,
Yeah.
saying that, let's get off our keister and get this done.
And it's interesting because the highway system is a great example of where people worked very hard for a very long time to get that done. The first bill that was proposed actually was proposed in the mid-30s, early 30s, for the national highway system, and it didn't get done until Eisenhower came around. So it took a long time, but the impact, economic impact, has been astounding, right? Does this have an economic impact that's by itself favorable as opposed to just defensive?
Well, certainly companies are going to make money at this for sure.
Yeah.
And then this is a archaic, power grid. And we need more microgrids. We need more decentralized power, which, makes us less vulnerable.
So you hinted at that earlier, and I wanted to kind of peel at that for a second, because it sounded to me like there's some stuff going on in Houston that may be more advanced in terms of the way that they're trying to protect their grid. Is that correct?
Yes. So CenterPoint Energy is, they've developed this Ciprotech system,
Right.
working with Siemens, and they are putting it on critical substations in Houston.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I think the concept of decentralization is important because that makes it less vulnerable to a singular attack, right?
In fact, one of my beliefs is that we should build microgrid systems to protect domestic water systems.
Well, yeah.
Because 410 water facilities control 92% of America's water. And the rule of three in survival theory says that individuals will die if they don't have water after 3 days. And so I visited a water facility serving Highland Park, and there's 100% dependent upon the grid. And they thought about doing a backup system with generators, and they thought that was too expensive. And they didn't decide to do that.
Wow.
And so even if you did have backup generators with diesel power, most of the diesel, generators only have 10 days of backup. So frankly, that's not enough time if we're talking about an attack, that we're talking about, or a geomagnetic disturbance.
What is the length of time we should prepare to accommodate if we had one of these attacks? Now, I would imagine it's different by attack, of course, but what's your rule of thumb that you would advocate?
Well, for water, it would be great if it was continual, where you have either a massive solar system combined with geothermal or a SMR, small modular reactor. Some of this engineering is being worked out. But I'd say 6 months at least, because if our transformers go out nationwide, then we order these transformers from Germany and South Korea and also from China. And so we don't make them in the United States, and they're massive. And if we have complete carnage in the country, I'm not sure if they're going to be back in 7 months, frankly.
Yeah. So you think 6 months is the right time?
Well, I think the problem needs to be addressed. It's a somber subject, and we need to put the best minds around this. But we just need a attitude adjustment with this.
So let's see if I can recap this in a way that that would properly frame what you're advocating. So thing number one is we've got a problem that's far more serious than people are currently taking it. That's thing number one. The problem can manifest in one of four ways. It's not just one attack that we need to worry about, but rather any of the four that could occur. And it could be a natural disaster of sorts. And we've seen historically that these natural disasters happen about once every 100 years at the very least. We need to rally around the problem by acknowledging it and then encouraging our political organizations, I'm sorry, not our political organizations, our elected officials and our regulatory agencies to go pay attention to this and solve the problem. And then lastly, there's reason for hope and optimism because we as a nation have done this before. We've identified big problems. We've set out on a course to attack the problem, to solve the problem, and we have in fact solved many of these complex, vexing problems. Is that fair to say?
Very well articulated, Todd. You should go on programs with me.
Well, with that, we're on this program, so that's good enough. All right, very good. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really elated that you're here. I'm happy that there are people out there looking at problems that most of us don't focus on, so I applaud your work here. It's hard work and it's somber work, to use your term earlier, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't go attack. Attack is the wrong word. That doesn't mean we shouldn't go focus on the problem, address it, and solve it. So I'm grateful for your work. Thank you so much. As always, if you enjoy this content, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm really grateful for David Tice and his work. Please take a look at the film as soon as you can. We'll have some language at the bottom of this that will help you, direct you to where to go if you want to take a look at it quickly, and then also how to encourage others who are elected officials and regulatory officials to go similarly pay attention to this. It's important and we need to address it soon. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Civil Discourse. To learn more about today's topic or our guest, visit www.the60percentsolution.com or www.tfip.group.